What if everything you've been told about the beginning of civilization is wrong? What if Göbekli Tepe, the site often called the 0 point of history, is not the beginning at all, but the final echo of something far older, something buried so deep in time that we've only just begun to notice its shadow? Because for decades the story seemed simple. Humans were hunter-gatherers struggling to survive, moving from place to place, until suddenly around 12,000 years ago something changed. They settled down, built structures, created culture, and slowly became what we recognize as civilization. But Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit that story, not even close. Because when archaeologists uncovered its massive stone pillars arranged in perfect circles carved with animals, symbols, and abstract figures, they weren't looking at the beginning of something simple. They were staring at something already advanced, already complex, already fully formed. And that raises a question that refuses to go away. How does something so sophisticated appear without a past? Where are the earlier versions, the prototypes, the mistakes, the slow evolution that we see in every other human invention? And the more researchers dig, the more uncomfortable that question becomes, because Göbekli Tepe didn't emerge from nothing. It stands like the tip of an iceberg, hinting at a much larger hidden structure beneath the surface of history, one that may stretch back not thousands but tens of thousands of years, into a time we thought was dominated only by survival and simplicity. No, imagine the world 20,000 years ago not as a primitive wilderness filled with scattered tribes, but as a planet undergoing immense pressure, the Ice Age still holding much of the northern hemisphere in its grip, temperatures, unstable climates shifting rapidly, and yet within that chaos human beings were adapting, learning, observing patterns in the stars and the seasons, in the land itself. And adaptation does not always mean regression. Sometimes pressure creates innovation. Based survival is not just about reacting, it's about understanding, and understanding over long enough periods of time becomes knowledge, and knowledge, when shared, becomes culture, and culture, when refined, becomes something that begins to resemble civilization, even if it looks nothing like our own. This is where the missing chapter begins, not in written records or preserved cities, but in fragments, anomalies, patterns that shouldn't exist if the official timeline were complete. And one of the most intriguing of these patterns is not Göbekli Tepe itself, but what surrounds it. Sites like Karahan Tepe emerging from the same region, revealing structures that are in some ways even more mysterious, more abstract, more difficult to explain. And these are not isolated discoveries, they are part of what researchers now call the Ta-Tipler network, a collection of multiple sites scattered across the landscape, many of which remain only partially excavated or completely buried beneath layers of earth, waiting silently. And what makes this even more compelling is that these sites do not show a clear linear progression. They appear almost simultaneously, as if they are remnants of a shared tradition rather than independent experiments. And that suggests continuity. Something existed before them, something that influenced them, something that is yet to be fully uncovered. But if such a culture existed, why is there no clear trace of it? Why do we not see its cities, its tools, its written language? And the answer may lie not in absence, but in destruction. Because around 12,800 years ago, something dramatic happened, an event known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden and severe return to near glacial conditions that disrupted ecosystems across the planet. Temperatures dropped rapidly, environments changed, and in many regions survival would have become extremely difficult almost overnight. No, imagine a developing culture, not yet industrial, not yet widespread, but complex enough to create shared knowledge systems, facing a catastrophe of that scale. Structures, abandoned populations, displaced knowledge, fragmented, not erased entirely, but scattered, broken, carried forward in pieces rather than as a whole. And what if Göbekli Tepe is not the origin of that knowledge, but one of the places where it was preserved, reconstructed, remembered in stone rather than in writing? Because writing can be lost, but stone endures. This would explain something that has puzzled researchers for years: why the site appears to have been intentionally buried, because instead of being abandoned and forgotten, it was carefully covered As if someone wanted to protect it, preserve it, hide it from something, or perhaps from time it's illified. If that interpretation holds even partially true, then we are not looking at a primitive society discovering architecture for the first time. We are looking at a society remembering something older, something inherited, something already understood. But the mystery deepens when we consider the symbols carved into those stones, animals arranged in patterns, abstract shapes that some researchers believe may represent constellations or celestial events, and while these interpretations remain debated, they point toward a possibility that cannot be ignored, that whoever built these structures was not only interacting with their immediate environment, but also observing the sky with a level of attention and consistency that implies long-term study. Because mapping the stars is not something that happens overnight. It requires generations of observation, pattern recognition, and transmission of knowledge across time, and that again suggests continuity, a lineage of understanding that predates the structures themselves. So now the question evolves. It is no longer simply what came before Göbekli Tepe, but who carried that knowledge forward, and how much of it still exists hidden in ways we have not yet learned to recognize. Because history is not just what survives, it is what we are able to interpret, and interpretation is shaped by expectation. And if we expect early humans to be simple, we will interpret their achievements as anomalies rather than evidence. But what if we change that perspective? What if instead of asking how primitive people built something advanced, we ask what kind of knowledge system could produce something like this, and what traces of that system might still be detectable today, not in obvious forms like cities or machines, but in patterns, alignments, traditions, myths, even behavior. Human memory does not exist only in writing, it exists in stories, in symbols and repeated actions passed down across generations, often without full understanding of their origin. And if a culture experienced disruption on a massive scale, it would not vanish completely, it would fragment. Pieces would survive in unexpected ways, scattered across geography and time, waiting for someone to connect them, not as isolated curiosities, but as parts of a larger structure. And that is where we are now, standing at the edge of a realization that history may not be a straight line, but a layered landscape where older chapters are not erased, but buried, compressed beneath newer ones, occasionally breaking through in places like Göbekli Tepe, forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew best. If civilization did not begin where we thought it did, then the timeline expands, and with it the possibilities expand, not into fantasy, but into a deeper, more complex understanding of what it means to be human. And perhaps the most unsettling part of this idea is not that something existed before Göbekli Tepe, but that we are only just beginning to notice it, which means the real question is not what we have discovered, but what we have missed. Because right now there are structures still buried, sites still unexplored, data still unconnected, and every new excavation has the potential to shift the narrative again, not by rewriting history in a dramatic moment, but by slowly revealing that the story was always incomplete. And if that is true, then the past is not something fixed and distant, it is something still unfolding, something that continues to change as we learn how to see it differently. So the next time you hear that civilization began 12,000 years ago, consider the possibility that this is not a beginning but a boundary, not the start of the story, but the point where our understanding begins to fade. Because beyond that boundary there may be another chapter, not lost, not erased, but waiting. And the only reason it feels impossible is because we haven't fully uncovered it yet.